Good evening. I'm Dan Lothian of GBH. Thank you for joining us tonight for our second virtual forum on the state of race in Massachusetts, partnered with the Boston Globe, the NAACP Boston branch, and the World Channel. I want you to imagine sending your child to school. They arrive to see teachers who don't look like them, substandard buildings and classrooms without the proper teaching tools. They leave believing they don't deserve better and spend the rest of their life expecting less. Welcome to the opportunity gap, formerly known as the achievement gap. As for a definition, this bystander in Copley Square summed it up pretty well.
There is an idea of lowered expectations, and therefore what we want out of minority students and what we expect out of women students, particularly in STEM classes, is a form of opportunity gap. We don't expect them to succeed, so they don't succeed.
And this woman was adamant that money is the problem.
It's about dollars and cents, don't get me wrong, because there's plenty of charter schools that get money and the public schools go without. The playing field needs to be balanced.
But what if those things are just symptoms of the bigger issue? Does it all come down to race? And if so, what do we do about it? During the next hour, we'll talk about the opportunity gap from the perspective of a single mom, a public school principal, and our expert guests from our community and beyond. Joining me now, Gloria Ladson-Billings, former Kellner Family Distinguished Professor of Urban Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Good evening.
Jamal Grant, former Boston Public School student and founder of the NET Mentoring Group.
Great to be here tonight.
Bianca Vázquez, education reporter at the Boston Globe.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Gloria, Jamal, Bianca, of course, welcome to the show. And for those of you watching at home, we want you to join the conversation as well. Send us your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can throughout the hour. Let's start out with this stunning statistic from the National Institute for Early Education Research at Rutgers University. By the time children enter kindergarten, Black children are on average nearly 9 months behind in math and almost 7 months behind in reading compared to their white, non-Hispanic peers, even though Black and white children are enrolled in early childhood education programs at nearly the same rate. Early on, white children are far more likely to be enrolled in advanced and high-quality programs. So, Gloria, it boggles the mind. How in the world does this gap occur so early before kids even show up to kindergarten?
Well, Dan, your relatively simple question actually has a complex set of answers. And those answers include the individual, what teachers they seem to be placed with, the institutional, what schools they are attending, and systemic, the way the society is organized. And so in some ways, I'd like to flip that question and say, instead of measuring kids based on what schools want to know, what if we took a more neutral measure like human development? And here's what you'd find out. Black children, on average, sit, crawl, stand, and walk faster than white children, on average. But no one would say that there's a development gap between Black and white children. So we've got to figure out, what are we calling the standard? And what is it we're trying to measure?
And that's a huge lift, though, is it not, to change the standard? Bianca, maybe you can talk about that a little bit. You've been covering education for quite some time. Just changing the standard to look at something else to measure students would be like climbing up a mountain, no?
Perhaps, but we've seen a lot of crazy things happen during this time, right? And there are people in Massachusetts who are arguing for changing the standards that schools are measured by and looking at things like, student satisfaction, whether parents and children, the students, feel comfortable in their schools. And that seems like an important measure to me. And, maybe during this incredible, strange time when so many other things have gone out the window, like in-person schooling, maybe that'll get more traction now.
Right. And Jamal, I want to go back to this notion of the expectations game, right? If children really don't think that people expect a whole lot of them, does it in fact change their behavior?
I think this is a timely and very important question. I want to actually share perhaps a small anecdote from my life. As a child, kindergarten through second grade, I had no behavioral issues. I would like to say I was a great child. I will have to admit that perhaps I'm not the most objective judge of that. But third grade, I had a teacher, and that teacher, great guy, very nice guy, happened to be a white male. The problem, however, I would say was twofold. One was that his expectations didn't seem to match my potential. Secondly, I think lack of some cultural competency led him perhaps to, as well-meaning as being a well-meaning person, see my actions or actions of other students as probably more problematic or more tied to our environments than maybe they were. So I remember in third grade I had a teacher. He was a black male teacher who came in. His name was Mr. Dodson. Mr. Dodson came in. I had cried to my parents, said I did not want this super strict teacher. However, Mr. Dodson actually held me to a higher standard than my previous teacher. And this is even with, having very supportive parents at home. Mr. Dodson worked with my parents, and I remember him setting a standard for me. I want you to get all A's. And that all A's came in as a fourth grader at a time where, at the very least, subconsciously, I was defining who I was as a student. And from that, I started to define myself as a smart student, and that has not failed me ever since.
Wow. And to all of you, and I know because in my own life, I can look back at individuals who really set the high bar, right? Where others may have thought, well, this is what he can do. Others were saying, those that really stand out were saying, this is what we think he can do well beyond that. Is that really, that seems like a relatively simple fix, right? Just by looking a child in the eye and saying, no, you don't have to settle for being a C student or even a B student. You can really achieve A's.
Well, I'll say that I had very high bars set for me in my segregated elementary schools in Philadelphia, where I had teachers that were constantly pushing me, constantly telling me, you can do this. There's no reason why you can't be the best. What they said to me put me in good stead when I went to desegregated middle and high schools, where I was thought to not necessarily be the best, but I could hear that voice in the back of my head saying, no, you can do this. So those encouragements really do matter. And we have actually a fair amount of research on teacher expectation and what that yields.
So I want to now get a little personal with that, talk about this whole issue of personal biases and how it affects what happens in the classroom. Alicia Walker is a single mother of 3 living in Amherst, Massachusetts. Her oldest child, a 9-year-old, is in public school. He is one of only a few black children in his class and is even further isolated by his classification as a special needs student.
He feels singled out at times. He feels different. Also, just in terms of his disability, he wonders why he's not like the rest of the kids, why he needs to leave. To make it like a comparative measure, we did spend a year living in Springfield at one point because that is where I work. So we did try moving there for a year, and he did go to school there for a year, and we had a completely different experience. And their school system is completely minority students, like the entire district. There were no Caucasian students in his entire school. And so he had a completely different experience there, a more feeling of inclusion, not feeling singled out in the classroom, not feeling like his behaviors were making him different than everybody else.
Can you amplify a little bit more this issue of how he's treated by the educators? How do you believe they view him, not because of some of his needs, but because of the color of his skin?
I think those things, because of the color of his skin, those things are really closely tied together. And so I think that that even if he were a white student and he had an IEP and he had some of the same challenges, it still wouldn't be the same outcome because of how he's viewed. And so I think when he has instances or behavioral issues, I think he's viewed as frightening and as a threat, and as we need to get him out of the classroom. We need to separate him from the students. We need to keep him away from the classroom. Like, these things are continuously happening. And at first I thought it was like a normal response. and that this is must be the best that they can do, or this must be protocol. However, when we moved to Springfield, that was not the case. And I think that behavior and perception of behavior and just cultural competency plays a big role in how you view someone's actions. And so when he does something that appears to be a little bit more aggressive, or if he gets really upset and like pushes something, that's very alarming, and that's taken. Teachers here see that as a threat, but teachers in Springfield didn't perceive that as a threat. And I think it has a lot to do with his race and how that perception of him as a human, and then how that ties into his behaviors and how they are displayed.
Now, Jamal, you're a former student in the Boston public school system. You were talking earlier about not only having white educators, but there was a person of color who really sort of raised the bar for you. But nonetheless, most of your teachers were white. How did that impact you? And do you think it would have been different if the majority of your teachers were black?
For sure. So the parent we just heard from, Alicia, that is spot on and ties directly to what I was saying earlier. Small things that a student may have done were being interpreted as perhaps worse than they actually were, and that's something that really, really stood out. I spoke earlier about the issue being twofold. The second piece of it that I didn't get to is the fact that in a lot of communities that are low resources or low access, the only time that a child gets to see a glimpse of a world that is not their own is when they go to school. And the teacher becomes a proxy for success, for the professional world. So when you walk into a classroom, you walk into a school, and all your educators look and sound completely differently to you, and don't seem to actually have your lived experience, you start to feel, at the very least subconsciously, that you don't belong. So having teachers of color is immensely important, just so that you can see yourself there, but also, like I spoke about earlier, to have expectations match potential.
And when did you notice that? At what age did you notice that there were some of these inequities in terms of how you were treated and how your white classmates were treated?
For sure. So it wasn't so much that the difference in treatment that I noticed. It was more later on down throughout college. I remember in 2008, 2009, the economy had crashed. And we used to run out of paper and have to share textbooks in our classrooms. I remember I went to college and I met people from some suburban neighborhoods, like Concord, for instance. And I remember seeing these amateurly made pots at a friend's home. And I said, "Oh, wow, did you take a weekend pottery class?" And they said, "No, this happened in school." And these were things, pottery, home ec, things that I didn't even know were real. I thought they were from Disney Channel. So I started to realize that, I thought the economy hit us all the same. And that was a huge realization of inequity, at least in funding and access to resources.
And Bianca, to you, what about the curriculum? What is being taught in the classroom? Is that part of the problem as well?
I think it is in a lot of places, although it is changing. But, in a lot of schools, children of color don't see themselves in the curriculum. And many teachers have said through surveys, especially teachers in suburban settings, say that they don't feel comfortable or have the training, the preparation to talk directly about race. And we heard a lot of that during the aftermath of George Floyd's killing. A lot of teachers wanted to talk about it, but they felt like, they wouldn't be supported by parents or their district in doing so. And then there are other ways that children and parents receive messages that they're, not okay. If they speak another language, for instance, it often happens that if they're Black, brown, or Asian, teachers might tell them or discourage them from speaking that language to their children. They don't see it as an asset, whereas white children are often encouraged to learn French or learn other languages. For them, it's okay, but for children of color, it's a liability. And so there are many different ways in which schools message that families of color are not accepted.
Right. And Gloria, is there not a distinction, though, between having a conversation about race? I mean, that's difficult, I think, for anyone, certainly for a white teacher who has no real experience in teaching it. that becomes much more difficult. But what about introducing just other conversations around people of color, right? There are ways, not necessarily dealing with race specific, but here are some people of color who have done amazing things that you may not have known about. Sort of veering from the typical curriculum to add other faces into the conversation.
So what's interesting about that, Dan, is the fact that I guess last year the Children's Cooperative Book Center here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison did a survey to look at what books are available to children. It turns out that better than 50% of the children's books that are produced have white characters. The next largest group of main characters in a book are animals. And then something like 10% of those books have black faces, and then you go down from Latinx to Asian to American. So even having the resources is an issue for many teachers. Often, however, when teachers have that resource in their hand, they still don't know exactly what to do with it. There's a very famous book called The Watson Family Goes to Birmingham, summer 1963, and many of us are old enough to know what happened in Birmingham in the summer of 1963. So here are 4 little girls murdered in a church, and the book is a narrative about this other family from Detroit that goes to visit. I've watched young white soon-to-be teachers stay away from the murder of the children and talk all about the parenting style of the mother, just really not comfortable taking up the real issue.
Now, just recently, I want to sort of turn to some of the politics of the moment, and President Trump, who recently weighed in on the issue of what's being taught, the curriculum that's being taught in our schools. And there's this, he was talking about wanting to get away from what he described as sort of critical race theory and restore, quote unquote, patriotic education. Jamal, I know this got your attention. What did you think about that?
This certainly got my attention, Dan, particularly because this is not, necessarily racial history. This is American history. And the important thing to note is that we need to take a deeper look into how the middle class was built in this country and how the underclass was created in this country. That has a lot to do with histories of redlining, housing discrimination, exclusive GI bills, things that actually helped other groups of people to climb the economic ladder. And when we dig into that a bit deeper, I think what we'll see is that these are pretty superficial and misleading notions of meritocracy and bootstraps. So we start to think that you just work hard and you make it where you're supposed to go. And what that creates, I think, is a lack of empathy amongst people, not just students, but students, children who become adults and feel that, well, I've gotten where I am simply because of my hard work, and everybody else who's not where I am simply did not work hard themselves. So I think we need to really dig into the education and also the economics, because these things are interrelated. So when you talk about speaking about race historically, it's not simply to rehash all the wrongs and to talk about Martin Luther King, all of which are very important. We need to talk about the actual concrete things that happen that clearly still have lasting effects economically and otherwise today.
So I'm wondering to any of you who want to jump in on this, how will this push for a patriotic education? What would the impact of something like this be, and how will it impact kids?
Well, I would just argue that it often frustrates our students, because when they show up at college and actually have to read primary documents and they see something, they're very angry that they didn't learn this. And I'm not talking about black students. I'm saying white students are, why didn't I know this? It's interesting listening to Jamal, because one of the bedrocks of the American economy is home ownership and the mortgage system. But the mortgage system is built off of slavery, that indeed, when those planters couldn't afford to buy more land, they mortgaged the slaves. So, but no one talks about this. Once again, there's this discussion of, on my own, I worked hard and I earned this. But if you've got a people who worked for 400 years or over 200 years for nothing, and then another almost 100 years of minimum income through the sharecropping system, and then low-wage jobs, you are essentially condemning them to poverty.
I want to get someone from our audience who sent in a question. Kelly from Boston asked, Dr. Ladson, have scholars reached a point where a coordinated effort is needed to advance the importance of race and ethnicity beyond writing scholarly papers?
Well, you know, the lane that scholars find themselves in is writing. That's kind of what we do. We don't set policy. We don't do the practice. Now, could there be a better connection between practitioners and policymakers and scholars? Indeed. But, you know, we're almost at a place where we don't trust the people who have the information. We are actually seeing in the midst of COVID-19, the highest quality epidemiologists being discounted, telling us, you don't know what you're talking about. So it's really hard, I think, when you are in the academy to be able to make those connections with policymakers and practitioners.
So obviously, when we have these kinds of conversations, we want to hear also about not just the problem, but also solutions. And we've had conversations with high school principals who've talked about the cultural proficiency seminars and how they believe they have made a difference in their schools. One principal telling us that here are some of the results of the program in their school. An increase of teachers of color from 5% to 25%, detract math classes, decentered whiteness in school curriculum, and then abolishing student dress codes. By the way, not throwing out all dress codes, but being a little bit more lenient, especially when some of the ways that kids handle themselves have to do with their ethnicity. And so understanding that, that factors into the dress code. So Gloria, to you again, maybe you could explain to our audience what these cultural proficiency seminars are all about.
Well, first, let me just say that those statistics are astounding because I don't think that's true across the nation. And in fact, a lot of times what happens is people push back against such seminars.
Right. And it's not, again, it's not across, I should point out, it's not across the nation. This was a particular conversation that we had with a local high school principal who said, these are some of the results that we've seen.
Sure. Because we do know, for example, in law enforcement, implicit bias training only serves to make them angrier about having to be in implicit bias training. But if you have a willing audience, I think, and it sounds like this principal really did, people have the opportunity to interrogate some things that they hadn't even thought about before. They get to ask some questions they hadn't thought about before. And they begin to understand the way that culture, even their own culture, impacts the way they see the world. It moves them from this place where what they experience is more than just their culture, and that it's, quote, what represents truth. Well, that training says, no, that's a particular perspective. And then they get the chance to be able to hear what some other perspectives might be like.
Right, but Bianca, isn't it important to have these uncomfortable conversations for teachers to be, and this is mandatory in many cases, they have to attend them on a regular basis. They have to confront these kinds of questions and can't and issues and can't run away from them. Isn't that necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Gloria is right that it does sometimes have the effect of pushing some folks away. Unfortunately, I've been in those conversations. I've been to some of those trainings and watched it for my reporting, and it seems like oftentimes the people who are there are already the converted. And I don't know that they're always necessarily mandated for everyone. So I'm curious about whether people who really don't want to learn this sort of thing are really going to, and how you really change their attitudes.
Jamal, what do you think about this? The fact that these uncomfortable conversations are essentially being had with teachers who have no real experience or connection, perhaps, with some of these issues around, how to deal with a child of color. Is it important, even if it's forced, and even if they don't necessarily like it? Is it still important? Is there value in it?
For sure. I think we need to be mindful always of where people are. And the reason why is not to bend backwards to appease people, but just to actually reach your goal and reach people to bring them to what you might believe is is correct. Allow yourself to plant seeds of change in others' minds and have them do the same for you as well. But these conversations have been brushed under the rug for the entire history of this nation. And when you bring it up, it's going to make people uncomfortable. But that is no reason, or at least not adequate reason enough, to not have these really powerful and meaningful discussions.
Now, one of the principals I was referencing earlier who had these seminars and has these seminars in his school is Manuel Fernandez. He's the principal of the Cambridge Street Upper School, and he believes that introducing cultural proficiency seminars in his school has really made a huge difference. And he explains the motivation behind detracking math classes.
Our students would come into the school in their 6th grade and they would be all in the same classroom, heterogeneous grouping. A year later, 7th grade, the Black and brown children would look up in their math class and they would say, well, where's Caleb? And the white kids would look in their math class and they would say, where's Jamal? And then they figured out, they would say, like, we're not as smart as they are. I've even had young white students on video talking about their experiences as elementary kids that separated them. They were told it wasn't about anything other than we're just separating them into groups. But then when they get into middle school, they realize that they've been separated into groups based on accelerated classes versus remedial type classes. We abolished that. These children who were in these remedial type classes weren't given the opportunity to be challenged. They weren't given the opportunity to have a teacher slow down and explain it in a way that they can hear it, not just the way. See, good teaching isn't about you listen to what I say and you then figure out what I said and keep going. No, it's about me listening, me figuring out what it is that you didn't get.
Bianca, a lot of good points that he raised there. Does that dovetail with some of the conversations you've had as you've been out reporting in the field?
In some districts, certainly. I mean, Cambridge, where he is extraordinary. They've done a lot of really interesting, groundbreaking things, but there's still a pretty big gap, right, at their high school between the number of students who take advanced classes, Black and brown students in advanced classes, and those who aren't. So we'll see if this detracking effort makes a difference there. But in other districts, in Newton, for example, they've taken these courageous conversations, as they're called, and it's led to a lot of other groundbreaking things. This year, they're rolling out something called anti-racist grading, for example, and people there seem to have really embraced it. But again, I don't know that there's a real direct path to everyone, getting everyone on board with this sort of thing. It's an interesting journey in all these different districts.
Right. And Jamal, how do you feel that detracking would have worked at your school?
So Dan, I have a really difficult and tricky relationship with tracking. My whole life has been tracked. I was in the charter school and went to, were in the advanced classes there, then went off went to the John D. O'Brien School of Math and Science, which is a form of tracking, is one of the 3 exam schools, magnet schools in Boston. And in some ways, I feel that I would not be where I am today without having had those opportunities to be on those advanced tracks. That's on the one end. On the other side of that, tracking often leads to a tale of 2 cities, 2 districts, 2 schools, where some people are given opportunities to thrive, while the other students are given opportunities to barely survive. And I think that it's hard to say that there's a silver bullet in one way or the other, get rid of tracking entirely or track, extensively. But I do think that we need to start thinking a little bit more imaginatively how we meet students where they're at and also create a rising tide that lifts all students or all boats. And that's what I think we're lacking right now.
And Gloria, in meeting students where they are at, do you think, what are your thoughts about detracking?
Well, we have, again, a lot of research that suggests that tracking is not the way to go. Jeannie Oakes's book, Off Track, I mean, she's really looked at the way that tracking actually creates the disparity. And so if we can find ways to ensure, one of the things that I tell parents all the time, regardless of their race or ethnicities, I said, you're paying taxes too. So you've paid for that advanced placement class. Have your child take one that they're interested in. Not necessarily load up on them so they can, minimize the amount of credits that they need to get through college, but find something they're interested in and take one of those courses. Now, what we could do from an administrative point of view is say, as a principal, if you attend this high school, you will take at least one advanced placement class. That's a condition of graduation here. So we're setting the expectation and raising the bar for all of the students by suggesting that if it's a good course, why shouldn't everybody at least try that course? So I think that there are ways we can think differently. I look at Harvard, I look at Stanford where I went, they're not tracked. People can take whatever they want to take in whatever field they want to take. So what's good for who we see as the best of our kids is even better for the kids that we think are struggling.
And to any of you who want to weigh in on this question, how do you convince the parents to go along with that plan, to say, you know what, we're going to stretch your kids to go for that more difficult class. It's going to require a lot more support at home. How do you convince the parents to come on board?
Well, I think that's part of the problem, and we talked about this earlier when we were talking about high expectations, is I think a lot of the schools that have done this well, in Boston, for example, there's a high school called New Mission that expects everyone to complete calculus by the end, or at least that was the plan for a while. And they don't have gatekeepers. Anyone can take advanced classes. They don't, have to get checked off or signed off to be able to take them, but they offer them support. The school offers them support and tutoring. It's not up to, their parents. And so you don't have to have, a parent who is, has taken calculus to be able to help you or support you at home. You can get that help at school. And that seems crucial to me if you're going to have high expectations and really be able to help kids achieve those things.
Right. I mean, that seems to me like a major solution here, because even parents who are plugged in, highly educated, still have some challenges dealing with these high-level math or science classes that their kids are taking. Jamal, do you think that's the route? Provide additional support where maybe parents, especially from some communities where parents can't support it, provide that support at school?
I think that support is absolutely necessary. And I think it's also important to note that there is an information gap. And there's a narrative that's somewhat of a false narrative that tells you that all you have to do is send your child to school and have your child do all their homework and everything's going to be fine. And I think that a lot of parents, particularly immigrant parents, think, all right, well, I see my child doing all his or her homework. I see them, going to school every day. And then you find out later on that there's a gap between them and students in more privileged areas. So I think it's important when you're getting parents on board to actually kind of give them a glimpse of what they're kind of up against. And I hate to kind of say it that way because it's not supposed to be a competition, but it's much easier to get me to say I'm going to go the extra mile if I know that I need to go the extra mile. And right now, people simply believe doing what's being told, send your kid to school, doing the homework is enough. And in this day and age, it's simply not enough anymore.
Right. Have another audience question here. Siobhan from Newton asks, how do we best be aware of issues of inequity within our own communities to remove blind spots, especially since marginalized voices often do not get heard? Who wants to take that one?
I can jump in for a quick second, unless, Bianca, were you going to say something?
Well, find ways for them to be heard. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I've spoken to a couple of Boston Public School teachers, and they said that schools have been making an effort since the George Floyd incident to do kind of an up-to-speed training. And one school in Boston called it the 21-day equity challenge or something along the lines of that. And it's kind of brought people up to speed for all the things that they did not realize were issues before. So again, there's many information gaps, and one of them is really understanding the lived experiences of other people of other backgrounds. So I think simply getting people up to speed. could be helpful.
Hey, Jamal, I want to, this kind of bounces off something that you had said earlier. This is directed at you from Jessica. What do you believe needs to happen in the education system to ensure teachers are able to match their students' potential?
I think that is a very, very, very good question. I think one, we hear implicit bias training in the sense of law enforcement. I think that's also quite important to do in our schools, because the ways that we categorize people are subconscious. And the ways that we say this student is not capable of XYZ happens with the smallest of things, the smallest of behaviors, a way a student speaks, the slang that they might use. So I hate to just say it's as simple as training, because it's not. These are complex issues. But I do think we really need to get into some of that implicit bias training. And also, I think there could be some type of accountability or accountability buddy system where you take a situation and you run it by somebody else, somebody of a different background. Perhaps it's a liaison within the school or a counselor within the school who's trained in these issues to kind of just say, hey, well, maybe you're not looking at the situation quite the right way. But I think a lot of those biases that we have and that we've been taught are kind of what cause us to say, again, subconsciously, that this student doesn't have the potential that we think.
I also think you would probably want to do what I would call an equity audit in a school, to look at your data. I think a lot of times people think that, someone just has a chip on their shoulder, or they just look at your data. Who is getting into which classes? What do your suspension and expulsion rates look like? Do they break down along racial lines? Which kids are in special education? Which kids are in advanced classes? And then to raise the question, how do we explain this? With their very own data, I think that many teachers are actually shocked when they see the pattern. It's not just that one kid that I have sitting in the back of my classroom. It's across our school. So now we've got a pattern, and we've got to be able to explain that pattern.
And Bianca, have you ever done any stories on that issue in particular, these audits?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's becoming, more common that districts are digging into this. Boston is fairly transparent with its data. That way they think about these things along that line, and a lot of suburbs are doing the same thing around here. And in particular around children who are in special education, for example, there's a lot, it's quite disproportionate in Massachusetts. And that was the type of work that people were definitely doing before this horrible event has taken people's minds and attention, and put it on, just trying to get people back to school. But yes, that has been the trend around Boston in the last 5 years to really dig into these numbers, and in conjunction with having these types of difficult conversations about racism and implicit bias. And some districts were making moves.
And no conversation about education can be had without focusing on standardized testing. And frankly, we could do a whole show about that. But there was a question that came in from Facebook from Diana, who said, do you think that standardized assessments and accountability measures perpetuates the opportunity gap?
Well, I'm happy to jump in on that
Sure.
one, because we're starting to see at our highest levels, the University of California system is going to do away with the SAT. We're having that same conversation here at the University of Wisconsin. So if at the upper levels we think, oh, we don't need to use these tests. I think Harvard is talking about this. We don't need to use these tests. Why do we assume we need to use them at the lower levels? They do often exacerbate some of the issues that we are looking at. And we have all kinds of reasons for that. You look at a person like, you look at the work of someone like Claude Steele and the notion of stereotype threat. There are lots of things that adversely impact students when they take these tests. And then the final thing I'll say is, often we say, well, the kids are not taking the right classes. But if you look at a high-performing youngster, you will see they're not ever taking just one math class. They're taking that math class they're assigned to, but they're also in the computer club, or they're also in the chess club. They're in a variety of environments in which they get to use that mathematics over and over again. That's not the experience for the youngster who comes from perhaps a lower income community and just takes that math class.
And anyone, you can also answer this, but any of you can jump in as well. These tests, are they structured? Are the questions structured through a white lens? Is that part of the problem here?
So there has been research that has shown that they are structured in a way that disadvantages students who have not had more of a typical white lived experience, not to generalize. But standardized tests in part came about to find a way to normalize across different groups, right? So there's school A and school B. How do you know that a student is qualified if they grade differently? And what used to be a tool that was used to normalize now actually is used to exclude in many ways. And I think we've kind of gotten away from realizing what a standardized score is supposed to do. So it's supposed to measure some baseline level of competency to know that X student can do well in this school. What it's become, however, is do you have the best score? Who is the best test taker? And the best test taker is not necessarily the person who's going to be the most successful in the school. So you're using these metrics that, while not arbitrary, are not necessarily indicative of what you should be looking for in students. So when you're an admissions counselor and you say, hey, well, maybe we're not getting rid of SAT scores, but you should look at students and their profiles a little bit more holistically. So perhaps I don't have the best SAT score, but maybe I worked 2 or 3 jobs and took care of a younger sibling. And that might speak more to my ability to do well in this situation than another student who might have done better and had kind of their lives more in order than my own.
All right, good point there. Good point. Bianca, you alluded to this, COVID. And how that sort of plays into everything in your reporting. What are you seeing in terms of the impact this is having in education? Because in our last State of Race forum, we pointed out that there's sort of this disproportionate impact that it has on people of color.
Right, just like it's had a disproportionate impact on people of color in terms of their health. In Massachusetts, it's having a disproportionate impact on who goes to school. We are seeing that it looks like, sorry, I'm going to refer to my notes.
That's okay.
About 70% of children of color, or rather 2/3 of Black and Latino students live in districts where schools are starting the year remotely. And 70% of white students live in districts that are offering in-person school this year. So we can hope that remote schooling will be better than it was in the fall. In the spring. But we know that a lot of districts were spending a lot of time this summer focused on coming up with different plans and logistics and outfitting their buildings and so many different things that they didn't have a lot of time or energy to put into figuring out how to deliver the way that a lot of kids are going to be learning this year. So, I'm really concerned that, in districts where in-person school isn't an option, or in districts where it is, a lot of children of color have opted to stay home because they feel vulnerable. And I worry that the education they'll be receiving compared to their peers who are in person will be inadequate or less robust, certainly. So we already had an opportunity gap in the state, and I fear that it's going to become much worse this year.
Gloria, you agree with that this opportunity gap could widen potentially because of COVID?
It could widen if we're going to keep doing what we've been doing. So I've been giving a lot of talks lately about the need for what I call a hard reset. All of us have these devices that we use all the time, and sometimes they don't work. And when they don't work, we try a few things and we go online, look for a support group, but we eventually make our way to the store, and somebody who is 17 years old in a t-shirt is going to help us get this thing fixed. And they will tell us, I think I need to do a hard reset. Now, we don't want to hear that, because that means if you haven't backed that device up, all of your contacts, all of your photos, that's all gone. and they're going to give you back a device that looks like it did when it came from the factory. We are at this place in education, I think, where it is time for a hard reset. And it's not as if it hasn't been done historically. After World War II, Japan did a hard reset with its schools. Italy did a hard reset. It said, you know what we've been doing has been a disservice to our citizenry. So we're going to do something different. So as bad as COVID-19 has been, I agree with the Indian novelist Arundhati Roy, who says it's a portal. It's a dividing line between an old world and a new. And we can go into that new world dragging all of our old prejudices and our greed and our narrow thinking, or we can leave that behind and go into this new world, as she says, with light luggage and be willing to fight for this new world. So in some ways, I think COVID-19 can provide us an opportunity. Whether or not we'll take it or not, I don't know.
But Jamal, you know, this reset that has to happen, it's hard to reset someone when we're not even sure exactly where this is all going and frankly, where we are now. I find that schools are still struggling to kind of figure out things on the fly. So yeah, it's important. This is a moment where I think we can have this reset at some point. But before we get to that reset button that we're going to hit, you know, is there going to be a lot of challenges in between, especially for kids of color?
There are going to be many challenges. There's actually McKinsey, the consulting firm, has been done some research on this, and every student, well, students on average across the country are expected to lose approximately 7 months of school effectively is what the impact will be. Black kids are at about 10 months. And the worst is for just low-income students overall. And they say that the impact down the line to our GDP, which maybe might not be the best metric, could be up to $200 billion. So a lot of students will be adversely affected by this. And I've spoken to a couple of Boston Public School teachers, and one teacher just told me yesterday that there are students, we're using technology, we're using Google Classrooms, but there are students who are in middle school who don't know how to copy and paste. And what that tells me is that COVID is actually, amongst many other things, is also a flashlight that is actually shedding light on issues that have been below the surface. So before, you may not have had the opportunity to see what the disparities were between one community and another, particularly as it pertains to technology, which will be such a huge part of the workforce and jobs coming down the line. And to know that there are students who can't copy and paste while other students are doing programming and Scratch and so on, that lets us know that we're on track for a widening gap that will do a number, I guess, on our communities if we don't look at this through Gloria's lens and say we need a hard reset.
All right. Okay, I want to talk a little bit here about money. Money is always important in everything that you do, certainly in education. And Gloria, when we started out the show, a couple of the folks we spoke with out of Copley Square talked about how, part of the problem of the opportunity gap has to do with funding. How do you think funding plays into this problem?
Well, I can tell you from conversations with colleagues around the world that nobody outside the United States understands our funding system. They say to me all the time, you mean if you live in a poor neighborhood, your school's going to be worse than somebody who lives in a they don't get it. And that has to do with the fact that, constitutionally, we have no place for education. It is left to the states. And one of the ways that the states had decided to do this was through the use of property taxes. And so as long as that becomes the fundamental way we decide that, we think of kids as belonging to neighborhoods as rather than being citizens, So if you're in a good neighborhood, you get a good school. If you're in a neighborhood that's struggling, you're going to get a struggling school. That's, to me, part of the hard reset is our sitting down and having the conversation about what are students actually entitled to? What should they have? Again, I think about the land grant colleges and these great state universities. Those state universities were set there for every student in the state, not just the students who live in Ann Arbor or Chapel Hill or Madison, but every, from the far reaches of Wisconsin or Michigan or North Carolina, because their parents are taxpayers in the state, they should get that consideration. That's the kind of conversation I think we're going to have about our pre-K-12 systems.
Right. And you talked about property taxes. I want to bring in an audience question here from Lisa from Medford. She's asking, how can we address inequality in property taxes, which ultimately lead to school funding inequities, without asking underserved students to travel outside of their communities? Busing students from lower income areas to quote unquote better school districts place an incredible strain on students who have to travel long distances to and from schools. And we know that's been going on for decades here in Boston. Bianca?
The question is, how do we do that without asking them?
Yeah.
Well, I think Gloria has suggested that we rethink the way that we fund schools. We know that in Massachusetts, even though there's supposed to be a progressive system that makes sure that every school, or every district has a certain amount of money determined by the state to be necessary to educate kids, there's nothing stopping wealthier districts from pouring in heaps more money. And perhaps this is the time to take another look at that, instead of asking students from Boston to bus out to Newton or Lexington, which seems even like an even harder ask right now when people don't want to get on buses.
Yeah. Jamal, is it just hard for educators to let go of what they know, let go of sort of history? This is what worked 10 years ago. This is what worked 20 years ago. It's hard to push beyond that and be innovative. While we're seeing that, and we pointed out some pockets of where people are trying some new things. But is it hard? Are you bucking the system? And that's what the challenge is here?
I think there are a lot of difficulties there. There's a lot of discussions about, for instance, school choice, charter schools versus public schools. And it's hard to come down on just like one side of the debate on that. But charter schools were founded in part to be laboratories to test out new pedagogy and innovative things. And then there was supposed to be a pipeline to the public school systems where public schools could adapt. Right now, I think that there's some challenges with charter schools, and then one of the challenges with public schools is bureaucracy. And I think there really needs to be kind of a synergistic approach to this, particularly in this time of COVID, where we capitalize on that stability from public school systems and that non-exclusive nature of public school systems, but also some of that nimbleness and adaptability exhibited by charter schools. So I don't think it's so much that people are just being stubborn, but just the nature of the systems and the structures makes it really difficult to change. And Dan, I want to jump into a point that we spoke about before, which is money and funding. I want to get a little bit more specific and not as abstract, because we need to think about what the utility of money is. In some scenarios, in past years, perhaps money was the difference between me having a brand new textbook versus a 15-year-old textbook. Money today will be the difference between a student learning coding by the time they graduate high school versus a student not knowing how to use Microsoft Word. And in an economy and that requires these tech skills, and at the beginning of this fourth industrial revolution, if you will, it is so tremendously important that we have funding to get students up to speed. And it's kind of sad, because it seems that every time people of color or black people reach a boat, the boat has just left the shores. And one of those examples is college. Everybody should go to college. Everybody should get a college education. Now, when some college degrees are becoming just like another high school diploma, what a high school diploma was years ago, now black people are prepared and have access to funds to go to college, but that boat has already shipped. So my fear is that we miss this opportunity that is the beginning of this fourth industrial revolution, this opportunity to get people up to speed, particularly groups that have been historically disenfranchised, before that boat leaves again and it becomes a natural skill that everybody knows how to program. So, and again, it sucks that we have to think of it in this way, this group versus that group. It's not what it is at all. It's just really trying to bake equity into our systems.
Now, Jamal, go ahead.
It is that way. I mean, right now during COVID, money is making a huge difference in who gets, buildings with ventilation, or who gets to test their teachers for COVID every twice a week, right? There's only one district in Massachusetts right now, and it's one of the wealthiest districts that's planning to test its teachers twice a week. Very few districts are planning to do that, and there's a huge inequity there.
And I think one of the challenges is that we're actually trying to litigate our way to equity. I've been an expert witness on a number of funding equity cases in New York and in South Carolina. And it's the lawyers, I think, who are saying, look, here's what we see. But I'm not sure we can litigate our way to this. I think at some point it has to do with our political will and our concern about what is going to happen to this nation if we continue to operate the way we are.
Now, our conversation has been mostly about K through 12. Jamal, just a while ago, you touched briefly on college. When the opportunity gap after students graduate after 12th grade and those who do go on to college, there are still some challenges there. Talk to me about how you personally ran into that with another friend, is my understanding, who went to a school in Dorchester, and the differences between what you understood about math and what he was able to understand.
For sure. So when I was in high school, I didn't think about this in political terms, but I was effectively a bootstrapper. I thought that the inequities that existed were simply because people weren't working hard enough. I got to college and realized I went to University of Massachusetts Lowell, amazing school, but also a very blue-collar school that kind of brought people from blue-collar backgrounds, people from more means, people from less means. It was my first time being around people different than myself, really. And what I started to see were students who came from other schools in Boston that were not the 3 exam schools were struggling mightily with things, particularly math concepts that I had known since early high school. And part of what was extremely sad about this was some of these students were students who were the cream of the crop at their high schools, salutatorians, top 5 in their graduating classes. And I watched kind of as the discouragement settled in, and also the difficulty for people to catch up once they came in this far behind. And, sometimes people say, well, Jamal, you made it out, so why can't everybody else do it? Made it out. And there's this analogy I like to use, and perhaps it's just my engineering background, but I like to think of like a pipe. So you have this pipe, and 10 gallons per minute are coming in on this side. And on the other end of that pipe is success. If you get it out on that side, success. You pour 10 gallons per minute inside one end, you get 10 gallons per minute of success on the other side. But when you're looking at students who grow up in low-income environments or challenging communities, there are all these holes in that pipe. There's a whole low-income hole, low self-esteem and academic self-esteem. Sometimes there's violence, there's lack of resources. And what you end up getting is 2 gallons per minute coming out on that other end. And then what you're looking at is that 2 gallons per minute, which I guess in this case would be me, and say, well, Jamal, why couldn't the other gallons do what you did? And that's what I started to see in college, was that there were all these gaps, all these holes that made it very difficult for so many well-meaning, hard-working students to kind of make progress. And watching a lot of those students leave the engineering field and kind of go into maybe careers that commanded less salary, I was watching this opportunity gap transform into an income gap, which is just compounded by the wealth gap that already exists. So it was really sad to see that, but it was really watching that at University of Massachusetts Lowell that kind of humbled me and caused me to dig deeper into these issues.
So as we wrap up this conversation, and just bouncing off of the pipe with the holes in it, where all of that potential is leaking out, what can all of us as individuals do to plug some of those holes so that more are coming out at the other end, as you described?
For me, I think that we need to look at addressing the opportunity and the mentality. The opportunity being the mentality of people. The opportunity being systemic challenges, and the mentality being some of those social challenges, the self-esteem, the resources at home. And when we're looking to help a student, we're not just saying, hey, here's this opportunity to join METCO. Great opportunity. And for those who don't know, METCO takes students from the inner city out to suburban schools to get a better education. So that's a great program. But the mentality is meeting people where they're at, understanding what resources they are lacking, meeting teachers where they're at and saying, hey, like maybe these biases are factoring into how you judge students. So opportunity and mentality. I think any solution needs to address those two.
Okay, Bianca?
Having empathy for others and their situations right now, considering that so many people have different approaches to how they're deciding to educate their children right now, and being mindful of our own privileges in this moment, and allowing for children who really need to have an education to have the space and the resources. Right now we have limited resources, and making space for them to be able to go to school.
And Gloria?
Well, I want to pick up on Jamal's analogy, because I think what it exposed for us is that just looking at education as the problem is disingenuous. We have health gaps. We have food gaps, like food insecurity. We have wealth gaps. We have employment gaps. We have housing gaps. So all of these things are happening, and we see it happen when a 5-year-old shows up and has been impacted by all of these things. And yet somehow we expect that 5-year-old to rise above all of that. And that is that's just a mountain that's too steep. I do want to say to Jamal that I have an honorary degree from UMass Lowell, so we're classmates.
Oh, shout out to you.
Well, all great closing comments from all of you, but I want to add to that as well, Alicia, that mother from Amherst, who's working very hard in her community to help close the gap for her son, and I asked her if she was hopeful for his future.
I am optimistic about my son's future, because he has me and because I'm going to fight for him. I'm doing that because I know that there are students who don't have people that are going to fight for them, and they deserve that. And so this isn't just for my son, this is for all of the students who are like him, because I was once a student who was like him. And I feel like it was chance that I was successful, because I have a lot of friends who I grew up with that this was not their outcome. And so I think we have the potential and the ability to make significant changes because of that, but we need everybody to be on the same page.
Thank you, Alicia, and all the community folks who weighed in with their comments. And of course, to our special guests, Gloria, Jamal, Bianca, lots of food for thought here, lots for us to really hopefully build on to help fix the education system for minority kids. And thanks as well to all of our partners, the Boston Globe, World Channel, and the Boston chapter of the NAACP, which, by the way, just announced the good news that its national convention will come back to Boston in 2023. Thank you for leaning in with great questions across Facebook and all of the other social media platforms. Sorry we couldn't get to everybody, but a lot of great questions came in nonetheless. If you like the State of Race discussion and would like to support such events, please go to GBH.org to donate. We couldn't do any of this work without you. Next month, the State of Race will likely address the calls for police reform. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Dan Lothian. Good night.